The 3 principles that you know are being replaced by 11 principles. I don't have the capacity in my short-term memory for 11 principles, so when I first looked at that document, I went, oh God, because it's hard, right? When you first look at it, you're like, this is more complicated, it's more than I remember, it's more difficult, the language is more difficult, but if you take a while, you can remap it. And I'm going to try and walk you through that tonight as to how we can break it down to some key thematic areas. The next thing that's really important to understand, a lot of people will look at the new code and it seems scary because the language is regulatory. The APS Code of Ethics is aspirational. It's ethics, it's philosophical. We should consider, we should be, the new one says you shalt. You as a psychologist. In the old Code of Ethics, there was a dot point that said something along the lines of psychologists should obtain informed consent for, all interventions. 1 dot point. The new one has, I think, 12 dot points specifically dealing with informed consent. When you should get informed consent, how you should get informed consent. And in fact, the effect of it is no change, but it's more detailed. So when people look at it, it can feel really overwhelming. But that does reflect a philosophical difference in the difference between a code of ethics and a code of conduct. So the code of conduct is much more regulatory and it's more prescriptive in tone. So again, I'm seeing a lot of people at the moment on LinkedIn and Facebook who are reading it for the first time and they're freaking out because they're reading things that say, I must do whatever. Well, you always had to do that. Just the old code didn't tell you had to do that. You had to look at the old code and understand how common law works and understand how the privacy principle works. And if you understood all of those things, you knew that you had to do all of that in the first place, but now the new code specifically says it. So a lot of the changes are actually just taking things that we've already done and putting it in that more prescriptive and regulatory language. So and we do have, thank you Gino, you do have copies on all of the tables, which I'm going to make you look at later on tonight. You're going to need it for answering your trivia. But if you do look at it, and this is the first time that you've looked at the code, I want you to take a mindful moment, freak out, feel the freak out, let the freak out wash across you, let the freak out disappear out into the ether, and then have a look at it and remember, this is in many ways just a remapping of what we already did. But there are some differences, and that's the bits that I want to look at tonight more specifically. Cultural responsiveness has been elevated. We've gone from the idea of cultural responsiveness being a nice to have dot point appendix Z at the end of our code of ethics to it's actually embedded. The word culture occurs 60 times, thank you ChatGPT, over the course of the document. It doesn't sit there as its own little thing at the end anymore saying, and by the way, you should be culturally sensitive. Every section reflects culture, and that's a big shift. And it's a big shift that reflects a shift within society, but it's a big shift, and that's gonna, I think for many of us, that's the one that is gonna take the biggest area of shift, because I know for me, I learnt nothing about Indigenous people. Captain Cook arrived, colonised the place, all good, we all got along fantastic, and then high school was over. I think there might have been World War II and there were some diggers and a gold rush, and that was my understanding of Australian history. And I think for many people of my generation, and actually not that many generations before and after, we didn't get that sense of cultural responsiveness. So I think for a lot of us, 30 plus, 40 plus, 50 plus, this is an area of growth that we're going to have to work into. The next big change, personal factors are elevated. There's a big focus on you as a person. That's now a whole section. In fact, it's 2 sections within the new code, and we're going to talk about that. And digital literacy has been added, and there isn't a specific section about digital literacy. You will find, you need to read the 2 documents in conjunction. The new competencies have a whole section on digital literacy. The code of conduct periodically refers to digital literacy. But these 3 are the big changes. The rest of it is just philosophical. Most of it is remapping and philosophical and changing the type of language, but then we've got these 3 changes. Does that all sound okay for everyone so far? No one's freaking out yet? Feel the freak out, let it wash. All right. Why? Why are we bothering doing that? Firstly, we're harmonising our code with other professions. If you have a look, there is actually a code of conduct for all health professionals that came in a couple of years ago. Psychology was one of the last holdouts to be an APRA registered profession and not have a code of conduct. It is an interesting question, isn't it? Why does a member society, which is the APS, it's a union, right? It's a club that you can choose to be a member of or choose not to be a member of. Why does the APS get to actually determine the rules? Do you want the RACQ determining the speed limit and the blood alcohol limit, or do you want that to be determined by the Department of Transport? And effectively, that's the question that came up. Fun fact, does anyone know why the APS got to set the rules? Anyone know? Is it just a historical accident, or? It's a Queensland case. Go Queenslander. Case came up, I'm going to say this is about a 1999 case. This is a psychologist who had an intimate relationship with one of her clients. He was a prisoner, she was a prison psychologist. She wrote a very favourable report for him. This is all in the public domain, so I'm not telling tales out of school. She wrote a very favourable report for him. He got released on bail. The two of them moved in together. He was rearrested for break and enter, and the police found that the two of them were living together and made a complaint to the Queensland Psychology Board. As part of her defence, she said, but I'm not a member of the APS. Why should I have to follow the APS Code of Ethics around how long it takes me to have sex with my clients? Over the course of STAP training, I must have read at least 100 VCAT complaints, APRA complaints. I've read so many of these as part of my workshop preparation. I've never read one before that the introductory material starts with a quote from Aristotle, because that's how far back they had to go to make the argument of why does a code of ethics exist? What are ethics? What are the principles and the philosophical underpinnings? And basically the board decided we are vulnerable to having exactly this same fight again. So about a week later, they officially endorsed the APS Code of Ethics, and every other board did the same thing. So again, go Queenslander. So that's why the change has happened. The next thing, it's a response to new legislation. For example, the Privacy Act. When the APS Code of Ethics was written, we didn't have a privacy commissioner. We didn't have mandatory reporting of privacy breaches. We didn't have a Privacy Act. We now have a bunch of legislation that actually directly affects psychologists. Can we expect psychologists to be regularly getting updates from their lawyers at every piece of legislation that is going to impact their practice? Not so much. So the Code of Conduct incorporates the relevant bits of legislation and kind of tells us what our responsibilities are. There were also some adverse coronial findings, and I'll talk about those when we come to risk, where the old APS Code of Ethics was found to be inadequate in a couple of areas. That was fixed by a patch in the Code of Ethics, but the new Code of Ethics actually directly addresses those adverse findings. The next one, there is a I'm going to try that again, globally growing globally. There's a globally growing recognition of the importance of recognition of cultural safety. It's fascinating for me because I'm reading material that's coming out of the US, I'm reading material that's coming out of New Zealand, Canada, the UK. They're all using the same language. They're all talking about cultural humility, they're all talking about decolonising psychology, they're all talking about cultural responsiveness, reflexivity, etc., etc. This is not an Australian phenomenon, this is actually a global phenomenon. And finally, it centres the regulator, not the professionals, not the professions. We can have opinions on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but certainly the government has decided that they would like to have the regulator at the centre of things rather than a bunch of professionals self-regulating. Is everyone okay with that so far? Nothing too controversial there? Alrighty. The risks for us right now. Anything I say to you tonight could be wrong. And why it could be wrong is that we have no precedents. I was on the APS board when the APS was involved in redrafting the Code of Ethics. We eventually decided not to release the redrafted version because CyBar said that they were going to do their thing. And I remember talking to Rachel Phillips at the time, and she said, my biggest fear if we make huge changes is that we don't have a body of law that we can rely on when we're actually prosecuting these cases. Right now, a psychologist has never had a complaint heard under the new code. So when there's words that are a little bit grey, we don't know how they're going to be interpreted until somebody gets complained about and a panel is impanelled and goes, no, actually, you probably did the right thing there, or no, your conduct is unsatisfactory. So the big risk for all of us right now is it's grey. Anything that I say to you is my best faith interpretation of what the law says, and the law is more prescriptive, but there's still a lot of room for misinterpretation there. Does that make sense? The big fear for me is that we're going to over-regulate ourselves because psychologists are so good at neurosing. Can I give an example? I'm going to highlight these two because they've been subject and it's very relevant to supervision, and I've seen them talked about so much in Facebook and LinkedIn recently. G, we shall inform clients of the period for which consent will be relied on in the absence of significant changes. H, revisit consent when the period of time referred to above has passed or there has been a significant change to the service or another aspect of the service-related relationship. Make sense? That has been interpreted in some circles as you need a new consent form every 12 months. Notice the word 12 months does not exist anywhere in the code. What it says is that consent is not forever. When you get consent from a client, you kind of need to tell them, is this till the end of therapy? Is it till the end of your mental health care plan? Is it until I set fire to your records in 7 years' time, or the age of 18 plus 7 years' time? How long is this consent valid for? And then part two, when do things change? For me, in the child area, the number one risk that I have is mum and dad bring the kid in for therapy. 6 months later, mum and dad get divorced. Mum says, I want you to do more therapy with kiddo because he's super sad. Dad says, I don't think there's anything wrong with him and I don't want to pay for the therapy. Now we're heading off to court. At the point at which there is a material or significant change, that's the point that I need to reconsent everyone. I could consent that person tomorrow and reconsent them on the 16th of October next year, and I would still fail this standard. So we need to understand what's the intent of the standards rather than come up with these arbitrary rules for ourselves. So that's the thing that I'm really worried about, is that psychologists, because we love a good simple rule, I think we're going to invent a whole bunch of simple rules for ourselves that are both time consuming and wrong. So I'm really hoping that people grapple with the code at a deep level rather than look for quick band-aids. Does that sound okay? You can see the point that I'm making here on this one? Alrighty. Let's talk about remapping. What I've got here is a fairly traditional map of the world, and I've taken those 11 competencies and sort of highlighted them. For those of you who are familiar with a map of the world, has anyone seen a Mercator map? Does anyone know what a Mercator projection is? If you look at a map of the world, it makes Europe look larger than it really is because of the curvature of the Earth. Okay, so in this map, Europe hiding up here, and look at this place. It looks like the kind of place that Trump might want to annex. Gigantic territory, worth having. It's actually tiny. The Mercator map fixes that and makes things look the size that they are. The Peters projection points out that in space there is no north or south. This is the Peters projection, and it's uncomfortable when you look at it. Even though you've been living on that whole place for the last 30 or 40 years, it's uncomfortable. We are taking the map of the place that we've been living our entire professional life, and we're just going through a discomfort. And in fact, the Mercator's and Peters projections exist for the same reason. They basically decenter Europe and look to put things at their actual place rather than where they fit on our traditional maps. Does that sound okay, just as a metaphor here? So let's go through. I am going to cluster these into 5 groups. We're going to look at 5 groups. The first one is cultural responsiveness. Respectful and culturally safe for all, and Indigenous cultural safety. It's worth noting they are 2 very specific standards. And yes, they're parallel, but they are different. Okay, so we need to read them. So let's have a look at, for me, being the white guy here talking about Indigenous standards sounds like the wrong thing to do. So I think it's really important that we actually centre Indigenous voices. I would encourage all of you, I've given the QR code, if you want to take a snap, can I encourage all of you, that is a free resource. It's made by the wonderful Belle Selkirk, Mary Goslet, They are the directors of the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association. It's only about 30 pages long. It's called the Listening More resource. And the fundamental idea of listening more is that as psychologists, we should talk less and listen more and learn from our Indigenous elders, colleagues, as well as clients. Okay, and it's a really good resource. I'd encourage all of you to get that because I think for most of us, that's going to be our biggest vulnerability. The big thing about cultural responsiveness, and by the way, anyone who's not aware, Diwali's coming up in 4 days' time. I've taken the Diwali photo. In terms of cultural responsiveness, we're moving from the old language says competence. The new language says responsiveness. Competence is hard to quantify. What is culturally competent? I've been to Diwali, I've had curry. Like, does that make me culturally competent? Responsiveness actually means I'm listening. Responsiveness means I'm talking to an Indian client or a Vietnamese client or a Chinese client and trying to understand how does your culture affect the work that we're going to do here. And some of them are going to say, not at all. And some of them are going to say it's a huge part of their story. Not that many, maybe 10 years ago, I had a supervisor who was an Indigenous psychologist, and I made the assumption that she would be wanting to work with Indigenous people. That wasn't part of her story at all. She's like, no, actually, yes, I'm Indigenous by genetics, but that's not part of my culture. That's not where I identify with. It's up to us to actually listen and hear that. So we're moving away from competence to responsiveness. Focus on reflexivity. Who's heard the word reflexivity? And it's different from reflectiveness. What's reflexivity? Does anyone know? It's about unpacking our stuff. So what do I bring to the table as a white, hetero, cisgendered, middle-aged man? What does the person opposite see in me when they see the white, hetero, middle-aged, cisgendered man? How does that impact the assumptions that I make about other people? How does that impact the assumptions that I make about myself? How does that impact the assumptions that I make about therapy? Reflexivity is an ongoing process. That's a big shift. Dignity and inclusion are central, and it's aligned with human rights law, okay? And specifically the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Everyone got our first group. So our first group is cultural responsiveness, and it's about reflexivity, responsiveness and listening. We all okay with that first? We're ready to jump onto part 2. All right, group 2. Psychologists as people. Specifically, there are very clear guidance about psychologist behaviour and about our proactive management of our own health and well-being. Okay? I'm sorry about the Lindt chocolates. I could have brought some, vegetables or something for you, but it's going to be Lindt chocolates. All right. The big change here, and this is going to sit uncomfortably for some people. 9.1b, and this is just an example. Understanding the importance of immunisation against communicable disease and take reasonable and effective steps to prevent the transmission of communicable diseases. There was nothing in the Code of Ethics that spoke to our position on vaccination. There is now something in the Code of Conduct. Now note, it doesn't say you need to be vaccinated. It says you need to understand the importance of immunisation against communicable diseases. That means if you are somebody who does not understand the importance of vaccination or does not agree with the importance of vaccination, there's some problems here. And this is new, and this is the bit that I really want to highlight. Personally, I'm on about I just got vaccinated 2 days ago for whooping cough. I've got a niece who's, due to give birth in a couple of weeks' time. I'm getting my whooping cough vaccination. But I'm aware that not everyone is on that boat. It's now harder for health professionals to be sitting in either a vaccine scepticism or a vaccine disagreement place. And there are increasing areas in that area of psychologist behaviour where the code is more prescriptive about what it expects from us. And that's something that we need to be aware of. So I would encourage everybody to look at those 2 particular areas just to make sure you're comfortable with them and just to make sure that you are compliant. I'm aware of the vaccination thing because we all went through COVID recently, right? We all had to deal with people who didn't want to wear masks, people who didn't want to get vaccinated, and the impacts that that had on our health services. That's now part of our code of conduct. Everyone okay with that? For better or worse, it is what it is. All right. There's very little change in psychologist behaviour. So the psychologist behaviour is very much as you'd expect beforehand. The other thing that has changed though is there's now quite strong language about proactive management of your own health and well-being. Proactive management of your own health and well-being. If you have physical, if you have emotional, if you have psychological health issues, we are expected to be proactive around those. And importantly, I can't remember the exact wording, someone can look it up if they like, but it says don't rely on your own judgment where it may be compromised. Go and seek the advice and input from someone who knows what the hell they're talking about. I'm paraphrasing. But that's the key message, right? We actually do need to be proactive, but also we can't just be thinking, well, I'm depressed, but I've been depressed before. We actually need to go off and get some advice and support on that. All good with that one? That's 2. All right, 3, our psychological work. There's 4 of them that speak to the actual work that we do as actual psychologists. There's a thing around safe, effective and collaborative. Safe and effective, we're used to. Collaborative is new. We always knew that we should be collaborative, but it's now in the code. There's now very specific things about what we should do around referrals, how we should work with our colleagues, how we should communicate with our colleagues. The expectation that you can open a private practice, walk into the door at 9 o'clock in the morning, leave at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and never answer the phone and never send an email is not consistent with the current the new code of conduct. Okay? Teaching, supervision and assessment, very little has changed there. Ethical research, very little has changed there. Working with clients, the same stuff that I've talked about. We're adding in that overlay of cultural responsiveness, etc. The major changes here, 4.2, consent is far more prescriptive. If you've got the code in front of you, if you have a look at 4.2, like I said, it's 12 items. 12 items just on consent. Harm to clients is acknowledged. There's now a section of the code, 4.5, that specifically talks about the fact that you will occasionally harm clients. And what are you going to do about that? How are you going to deal with it if they want to make a complaint? What are you going to do in terms of managing that complaint? What are you going to do in terms of remediating that harm? And that's new. The old code of ethics kind of assumed that everything we did was just rainbows and lollipops and helped everybody out and that that was good for people. The new code, not so much. Handover and termination provisions are far more prescriptive. We, again, under common law, we always had an obligation to people until they were appropriately handed over or closed or discharged. The new code takes those common law principles and makes it very clear in the code. So again, a lot of people are looking at it going, what do you mean I need to write a letter to the GP in order to... You always had to write a letter to the GP in order to close the case. But now it's there, it's in the code. Okay? This is a big one for people. Obligation on psychologists to justify couple or group therapy, so 4.10. If you want to be working with multiple clients, so I'm going to work with the 2 of you as a couple, I need to have a reason why I shouldn't be working with you as an individual and it wouldn't be more effective. Or if I want to work with this whole group of people, I can't just say, well, I was running a group and I thought it'd be fun to enrol them because I'd make more money that way. We need to have a clear formulation and treatment plan as to why were you going to benefit from the self-esteem group and why were you going to benefit from the self-esteem group and what was the benefit for each of the individuals. So 4.10 puts a very positive obligation, and I don't mean positive in terms of it's a good thing, but I mean it's a positive requirement for us to demonstrate I was putting that person in the group because I formulated them and I thought that they would benefit from the group, rather than I advertised a group and they clicked on the link on Facebook. Is everyone okay with that? Whether you're okay with it or not, we don't have much choice, but does it make sense? 4.2.E. This is interesting. No more de-identified case studies for teaching without explicit consent. Okay? If, and like me, I'm assuming that a lot of you have a catalogue of students, clients, etc., that you use to talk to your supervisees about to demonstrate specific points. Unless you have the explicit consent from that person to use them for teaching purposes, you can no longer use them. I did listen to the board webinar about this, and the board said, yes, we see that this is a loss of teaching opportunity. We would encourage you to develop amalgam cases rather than, I want to talk about this client who I met and she had a whatever particular issue. Now I'm going to talk about, imagine that there was a client who had this cluster of symptoms, and what would you do in this circumstance? So I think for all of us in this room, that's a really big shift, and it's something that we need to be aware of. Now, where does an amalgam case overlap with a de-identified case, with a piece of fiction, with a hypothetical? I think there is going to have to be a degree of personal, what's the word I'm looking for, self-regulation here. But the thing that they're concerned about is people recognising themselves. If I'm getting up and teaching and you're in the audience and I'm talking about you, that's a problem, if you recognise yourself. Is everyone okay with that? So that's a big shift. Working within a system. Again, safe, effective and collaborative stays there. You can see I've got that one here as well as in the actual work as a psychologist. Working with our colleagues, working within systems. The big shift here, something went horribly wrong on the formatting there. I'm so sorry. We've broadened the word intemperate criticism, so we always weren't allowed to make intemperate criticism of our colleagues. Now it's been broadened to include bullying. So we're not allowed to exclude them from Facebook groups or not invite them to lunch, or regardless of what their personal hygiene problems are, we are expected to invite them along to bits and pieces. There's a managerial, if you're in a management role, managerial responsibility to deal with bullying. There are health equity responsibilities in terms of we are encouraged to be promoting health initiatives, public health initiatives. Why I have this picture of the Walk for Awareness is that I'm not sure I can say no to my wife now when she says that we need to go to the Walk for Awareness. I think we all have to do the Walk for Awareness. I'm sorry, we all have to do the Walk for Awareness. We have to take part and be proactive in public health campaigns. And this is new. We need to recognise that resources are finite. The doctors have always had this. An MRI is a better scan than an X-ray. But if you've broken your leg, an X-ray costs $50 and an MRI costs $800, so doctors have to be really aware of the use of health resources. That's now in our code as well. So for me, where I think that probably impacts us is the idea of just having a whole caseload of people who aren't getting better and who aren't benefiting from treatment. It's no longer ethical to not be thinking about how to use those resources. So this is really interesting. There is also a responsibility in there about encouraging access. I don't know how that works in terms of as we need to raise our fees, because some of you would know that we sold our practice last year, but my landlord didn't have to encourage health equity when he raised rental fees, but we need to consider health equity in terms of the fees that we're setting and people's access to our services. So I think that's a really interesting one that I think we're all going to have to grapple with a little bit over time. And then finally, risk. Minimising risk to and from clients. This is the bit, many of you, do we recognise the Lint Cafe siege? Does everyone remember what the Lint Cafe thing was? Do we know why that's relevant for psychological ethics? The dude, Manmohan Monas, was known to a psychologist. The psychologist was aware that he had plans to go and shoot up a cafe and to take hostages. The psychologist never reported it. The reason for that is that the psychologist what was that, about 2010 or so, our Code of Ethics said you're only allowed to breach client confidentiality based on the Tarasov principle, which is when there is a known victim, you're allowed to breach confidentiality. The coroner at the time said, we live in an age of indiscriminate killings. This idea of known victims is a little bit stupid. So that's where we as psychologists, the yellow bit, so the patch, the APS Code of Ethics rapidly introduced this bit, which says the threat does not have to be immediate or specified. in order for information to be disclosed. Okay, so we changed that in the APS Code of Ethics. The new Code of Conduct is just written from the ground up to recognise it's not just about the management of suicide risk and the Tarasov principle. There are broader issues. Particularly, I know a psychologist in Queensland got a very adverse review around, I'm going to get the name wrong, I want to say Hannah Baxter. Have I got that name right? Hannah Clark, sorry, Baxter was the perpetrator. Hannah Clark, you'll remember that she was set fire to with her 2 children. Again, he was seeing a psychologist. My understanding is that the psychologist was not in a position to prevent that harm, but the same thing came up, that the signs of coercive control and risk for domestic violence, the coroner felt that the psychologist should have more adequately assessed for that as part of their treatment. So this is now a clearer part of our Code of Conduct.